Hi, welcome. My name's Sarah Wasson and I'm Reader in Gothic Studies at Lancaster University. This is a sequel, short activity slide set to go alongside the talk that I just gave, talking through a few approaches to Daphne du Maurier's novel, Rebecca. In that previous talk, I talk about different ways that the novel represents gender, represents desire, and constructs a fascinating array of characters. And I offer you various activities to use as you engage with the novel on your own terms. This is a follow-up set of slides to that, and this section is a little bit more creative. So we've already talked about these things to the first 4 points. In this set of slides, we're going to be talking about key entry points for adaptation. In that previous talk, I mentioned that Rebecca is very much a novel that has many, many echoes of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, that novel from the 19th century, which has so many close parallels to Rebecca, so many, in fact, that many people have said Rebecca needs to be understood as an adaptation of Jane Eyre itself. But there's more to be said about adaptation and Rebecca, because the novel Rebecca has itself inspired an astounding array of adaptations, not just Hitchcock's famous film adaptation, but also novel sequels, prequels, and companion pieces. So I'd like us now to take a moment and think about at least one reason why you think the novel Rebecca could inspire novelists to write sequels or companion pieces. And I would like you actually to take your copy of the novel and look through it and find some lines in it that you think help go some way to explaining why it's such an inspiring novel for getting people to write in this way or imagine sequels and prequels and companion pieces. So look through the novel, take a time, pause these slides right now and write your answer. Okay, so that's super exciting. A really, really interesting question to think about. I'm going to offer a few possible reasons why this is so fascinating to so many writers and other creators. We have really, really vivid characters. These characters are so alive and so strange. They are so compelling, and in that first set of slides I asked you to think about which characters fascinated you most, and we looked at how each of the characters really is so intriguing, is so thought-provoking. So have another look at those slides if you're wanting to think again about characterization in Rebecca. We also have a real lack of a tidy and predictable ending. There's so much we don't know the answer to, isn't there? We do know that the house burns. The novel ends with the flames, in fact. And we know from chapter 2 that the narrator and Max now live in an exile in sunny lands abroad. But we don't know what happened that night when the fire burned. Did they go back and fight the fire? Did they run away? What about Mrs. Danvers? Did she die in the fire? Hitchcock certainly gives us that impression. But what about anyone getting suspicious of Max again? How did they discover that her husband's a murderer affect their marriage over the coming years? I mean, that must have been an interesting discussion over the cornflakes at breakfast. You know, hi, honey, looking at them thinking, yes, you killed your first wife. You know, how does that play out? There's so much we don't know, so much we don't know. And of course, one of the most important things we don't know is Rebecca's side of all of this. And I'll get more to that in a second. I also wonder, does Rebecca still haunt them? Does she? I mean, the narrators all know we're fine now, everything's so fine, we're so fine, everything's terrific in chapter 2. But there's something a bit strange and febrile and weird about the way she says that in those sentences. And so I'm not entirely sure. Is she, is Rebecca still an issue for them? I suspect she certainly is. The narrator's so haunted by Rebecca, it's hard to imagine that she would stop being haunted. And there are also so many questions about Rebecca herself. The fragments we have built up are really interesting. She sounds disobedient, sensual, defiant, charming, and beautiful. Some of us might think that sounds like an interesting person we want to know more about. So last week we looked at the idea of whether Rebecca is a text that reinforces passive and rather formulaic ideas of femininity, or whether it's subversive text rebelling against such stereotypes. In many cases, the adaptations that have followed the novel tend to be going down the latter line, thinking about Rebecca as a subversive text that rebels against conventional gender stereotypes. So I'm going to now show you a couple of books that have offered themselves as a kind of afterlife of Rebecca. But before I get into those details, I want you to be thinking about how you might approach the challenge of adapting Rebecca. So after I've given this little talk, I'd like you to think about this activity. Imagine you are writing a sequel, prequel, or parallel text to Rebecca. How would you do it yourself? Which narrators would you use? Where would it fit chronologically with the original novel? What aspects would you develop in it? So think about that. Think about what you might do that's similar to these writers I talk about next, but also think about your own way. And also think, I'm saying here writing a sequel, but it doesn't mean you have to be writing it in a novel form. If you might want a video game, if you might want a film, or a graphic novel, fantastic and exciting art form, those are also really valid. And indeed, those are all things that we look at university. I teach graphic novel, in fact, quite often. It's really a thrilling and important medium, one of the fastest growing publishing sectors in the UK. So Susan Hill's novel, Mrs. De Winter, is really fascinating. It's from 1993. It's set about 10 years later, in 1950. And just to read you a tiny, tiny bit. I bent down, touched the cool, delicate, creamy, beautiful petals, the faintly ribbed, heavy leaves, and a sweet scent came into my nostrils from the flowers, intoxicating and yet faintly alarming, seductive and dangerous. There was a card, thick cream, inlaid with a black edge, and the lettering in deepest sympathy. But it was not the flowers at which I stared, in horror, not the printed words that chilled me and froze the world in me, splintered the sky and fractured the song of the blackbird, darkened the sun. It was the single handwritten letter, black and strong, tall and sloping, R. Yet again, we've got Rebecca's R, that writing, that signature that is profoundly alive and menacing. So it's the same nameless narrator as Rebecca, but the narrator is stronger now. It's a first-person narration, just like Rebecca was, but she is not the same. The narrator is not the same. And it's a really, really interesting take on things. We do see Rebecca in this novel. We see her, a picture of her in a pre-war magazine. And the narrators had wanted to see her always. She had repelled and attracted me for years. And of course we know that, don't we? As we talked about in that first set of slides, all the ways that the narrator's desire for Rebecca, her own desire for Rebecca, is very, very clear in the novel. So there's a lot more to be said about the ways Rebecca becomes a presence in that, but I won't say any more as spoilers in case any of you may be tempted. Instead, I'm going to mention another novel that's also very worth looking at. Sally Beauman's novel, Rebecca's Tale. This one's fascinating because it involves all the plausible intertexts, not just the novel, but the Hitchcock film and du Maurier's autobiographical notebooks, and Susan Hill's Mrs. De Winter book. So Sally Beauman writes as if all of those things are true. So it's very, very interesting. So the Hitchcock, Susan Hill and du Maurier's autobiographical notebooks. It's also meticulously accurate about Cornish topography and place. It's set 20 years now after Rebecca's death in summer 1951. Colonel Julian was in the original novel. Can you remember who he was? Yeah, towards the end. Okay. Terence Gray, who renames himself Tom Galbraith halfway through. He's an original character invented by Beauman. Really interesting. Ellie Julian is actually Colonel Julian's daughter. She's really intriguing too. And Rebecca herself. We get Rebecca's voice on the page. She writes a diary to her unborn daughter. What a fascinating move, right? So again, I won't say too much about that. I will say that as a sympathetic depiction of Rebecca herself, we find out about a traumatic childhood, possibly even sexual abuse. We found out she's exuberant and charming. She's not just diabolic and wicked. She's also charming and wonderful and vibrant and alive and very loving. The marriage in the novel is represented in very thoughtful and complicated ways. And I'm going to quote just a little bit from this novel, from Beauman's novel. This is Ellie talking after she chooses education instead of getting married. For her, apparently, it's a choice. It doesn't have to be a choice at all, but for Ellie, it ends up being a choice in some way. And she says this: I drove fast. I wanted to leave the second Mrs. De Winter behind as quickly as I could, and I think I know why. I'd suddenly seen the possibility I could turn into her. It was one of the options that could lie ahead of me after all. I'd hoped for love, like most people, but if that was what wifeliness meant, so in other words, if a kind of passive narrator mouseness is what wifeliness meant, if that was what wifeliness meant, I wanted to escape it as fast as I could. I no longer wanted to listen to the second wife. It was the first wife's voice I needed now. Amazing line. So this Rebecca's tale very much celebrates Rebecca and a different way of being. Okay, so those are 2 ways in, but there are so many others. And I'd like you to think about this question a little bit. Which strand of the novel might you take? And there's no limit on just one, of course. A haunted house, female identity. And that could be cis femininity or trans femininity, of course, because femininity is not an essentialist position. So maybe, either cis or trans femininity is absolutely something worth examining here. Rebellious, untrammeled sexuality, perhaps. Lesbian desire. Class-related anguish, perhaps, and the way class prejudice continues in the UK. Or something quite different. There are so many things you could consider there. And so in groups now then, I'd like you to think about this, or perhaps on your own if you're listening to this by yourself. Imagine you are writing that sequel, prequel, or parallel text to Rebecca. Graphic novel, a film, a game. How would you do it? Which narrators would you use? Where would it fit chronologically? What aspects would you develop? Have fun with it. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. So yeah, this is Sarah Watson, Reader in Gothic Studies at Lancaster University. Good luck with your English studies.